Salutare, prieteni, iată-ne iarăși urmărind împreună cel mai recent videoclip al lui Alex de la History Legends. Let's go!
My friends, it's just a matter of time before Avdiivka falls into Russian hands. Check out what the Global Mail had to say. The assault on Avdiivka is turning into one of the bloodiest battles of the Ukraine war. Meanwhile, journalists at the rear write, the forces of the Russian Federation are very far from the goal in Avdiivka.
All I'm saying.
Here's the best one. There is no hint of encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka.
Come on, don't bullshit me.
If things are so good,
Harta.
why did the Ukrainian army withdraw its command post and all senior officers?
Vedem nici o urmă de încercuire, dar chiar niciuna. Arată asta o încercuire? Da, nu este o încercuire completă, dar cel mai probabil rușii aplică tactica pe care au folosit-o la Bakhmut. Nici acolo nu au închis încercuirea, ci au lăsat mereu o cale prin care ucrainenii să alimenteze cu trupe zona de măcel. Și iată povestea repetându-se din nou la Avdiivka. Ce memorie scurtă au ucraineni.
From Avdiivka in the night of October 29th. It wasn't for some Halloween party. Honestly, let's just take a look at the map. The city is 3/4 encircled.
75% încercuire, cât de tare. Bă, și rușii ăștia. Bă, nu anunță și ei cu câteva luni în avans, când au de gând să declanșeze o ofensivă. Bă, nici măcar un trailer, un teaser, ceva. Chiar așa se apucă direct de treabă. Parcă strică și cheful. Serios acum.
We're cold. A very important factor of this battle will be the weather. The Russian army can easily house its troops and reserves in heated homes of the urban area of Donetsk. But Ukrainian soldiers won't have this luxury. As autumn sets in, with cold rain, the wind, the mud, the freezing nights, life in the trenches will become very difficult and morale might be impacted. And there are reports of entire Ukrainian platoons and companies that don't want...
Fac nani în ruine. Că între timp rușii au și nivelat Avdiivka.
To go on the offensive anymore, but everything is fine. Just like German newspaper Bild reported. Forgive my accent. Deutsche Panzer sollen Russen stoppen. German tanks to stop the Russians. It is believed that at the start of the Russian offensive, 15,000 Ukrainian troops were defending the sector of Avdiivka, but the size of the grouping has now grown to 30,000, of which 8,000 are positioned in and around Avdiivka, with the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade.
Avdiivka, aspirator de carne de tun.
Defending the city proper. All these troops are under extreme pressure, as all their fighting positions are constantly getting shelled. Officers from the 59th Brigade told Ukrainian newspaper Union that Ukraine could lose Avdiivka due to the heavy fire pressure from the enemy. It's not an empty fear. In this article, Bloomberg wrote North Korea sent 1 million rounds of artillery to Russia. Meanwhile, this Ukrainian soldier...
De ce să trimită coreenii obuze în rușilor? Știm cu toți că rușii fac o treabă minunată cu lopețile. Ruginite.
The following on Facebook. The situation is difficult. Avdiivka is semi-encircled, and this ring may collide. He means that the northern and southern pincers could link up. He continues by saying, I think we will see under Avdiivka what was observed under Bakhmut. Everyone knows that the Battle of Avdiivka is Bakhmut 2.0, with more Russian troops and no ammunition being held off. Here's what another Ukrainian soldier had to say. Avdiivka is a matter of time. Many of my friends from there are already in hospitals. As more and more people in Ukraine's war cabinet are doubtful about Ukraine's capability to win the war, any major defeat could become disastrous. Once again, for more PR points, Zelensky refused to evacuate the troops from Avdiivka and demanded that General Zaluzhny prepares the defense of the city. The Ukrainian armed forces are now transferring en masse all of...
Alex a avut un videoclip, da, când se ducea bătălia pentru Bahmut, în care îi spunea lui Zelensky: Zelensky, salvează-ți oamenii! Și Zelensky tot așa, nu l-a ascultat pe Alex și a tot trimis carne de tocat acolo. Sau, mă rog, carne la tocat acolo. Cred că așa e mai corect. Iată cum, din nou, suntem în aceeași situație.
Available reserves to this sector, like the 47th Mechanized Brigade with its Leopards and Bradleys. It's also very possible that the 2nd Battalion of the International Legion was also sent to the Avdiivka meat grinder, just like the foreign fighters were sent into battle in Severodonetsk and Bakhmut. The objective is to launch counterattacks on the Russian flanks in order to prevent the enemy from completing the encirclement of the Avdiivka cauldron. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russia-Ukraine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has...
Și eu vă mulțumesc celor care mă susțineți din postura de membri ai canalului Noaptea Minții sau pe Patreon. Nici acest videoclip nu va fi monetizat, deci susținerea voastră chiar contează.
Helped and welcome to the headquarters. To really understand what's going on, let's start with an overview of the battlefield, with all the strategic positions that have to be defended by Ukraine. Obviously, first we have the city of Avdiivka proper. As you can see in this video, one neighborhood is made of dozens upon dozens of multi-story commie blocks. Just like we saw in Bakhmut, this sector is like a citadel, and it's probably housing the bulk of Ukrainian reserves. Other than that, the rest of the city is composed of residential housing. For now, there's no general assault against the city proper, and the Russians have resorted to softening Ukrainian positions with constant shelling. In this video, you can see the effect of Russian artillery in a shattered residential sector of Avdiivka. Storming the place will be difficult because there are countless of defensive positions, tunnels and bunkers all around the city, which would have to be individually captured and secured before any push forward. The next obvious strategic position is the waste heap north of Avdiivka. Here's a view from the Avdiivka factory of this 200-meter high ground. As you can see, it completely overlooks the entire battlefield. The Russians secured this area on October 24th, and the Ukrainians wasted a bunch of drones in an attempt to destroy the Russian flags that were being raised. Of course, the control of this area opens a path for a direct assault of Russian forces.
Da, știți povestea cu ucrainenii care cu drona au lovit steagul, da, și pe urmă rușii, controlând zona, au repus steagurile, dar de data asta nu mai era steagul Rusiei cel de jos, ci cel de sus. Ca să nu existe discuții că rușii au venit cu niște filmări mai vechi. Da?
On the coke plant, positioned right in front of the waste heap. Long story short, the chemical factory of Avdiivka was built in 1963. It's your typical Soviet industrial area, just like in Mariupol and Bakhmut. At the moment, Russian recon units are continuously trying to get a foothold in the factory, however, for now without much success. If the coke plant falls, the Russians could aim for a small and tighter encirclement and close the ring around Avdiivka. Let's be honest, the coke plant is of strategic importance for Ukraine. It can easily sustain Russian artillery shelling and various airstrikes. And there are also so many firing positions. Remember what the Germans faced in the industrial area of...
Mie amintește de Azovstal, de la Mariupol. Da? Și știți cum a fost rezolvat Azovstalul? Prin încercuire, și rușii au așteptat răbdători ca ucrainenii, eroii Azov, să se predea și să se lase cercetați la tatuaje.
Of Stalingrad, so I don't think the Russians will simply storm the area and launch a head-on assault. unless they're ready to take massive casualties. In my opinion, the Russian army will try to bypass the industrial area. Perhaps they will attempt to secure this residential sector before making any move on the coke plant. Another possibility is bypassing it from the north, and this is where I have to mention the village of Ocheretine. Remember, I told you the Russians massively bombed its train station on day 1 of the offensive. As you can see on the map, the Ukrainians can use its railway station to quickly bring reinforcements to the zone of operations and disembark heavy equipment, which can then intervene all along the front. It's through Ocheretine that the 47th Mechanized Brigade was urgently transferred from the Robotine sector to Avdiivka. We all remember this unit as being the flagship of this new Ukrainian army, as it was one of its best trained and best equipped formations. And the 47th will be used as a fire brigade, meaning they will go left and right to prevent any fires or enemy breakthroughs. Actually, it would be more accurate to say that the 47th Mechanized Brigade used to be an elite formation. Due to the heavy losses during the summer, the brigade was filled up with mobilized personnel. For sure, they went through some form of NATO training, but we all know what that's worth, right? It's also interesting to point out that according to the few pictures that were publicly released, the men of the 47th traded their fancy M16s for Soviet-era AKs and RPKs. And regarding these new recruits, German media outlet Handelsblatt reported patriotisch aber unerfahren, patriotic but inexperienced. Honestly, this is what makes me so mad. Instead of taking the time to rebuild a strong Ukrainian army, all these mobilized troops are directly sent into another meat grinder, where there will be casualties within a week. In the last few days, through intense fire support, the Russian 1436 Motor Rifle Regiment, mostly composed of mobilized personnel from Siberia, managed to cross over the train tracks and managed to push 1.5 kilometers towards Kalinovo. That's why in late October, the 47th Mechanized disembarked at Ocheretine, and then the brigade split up. One column went to Novobakhmutivka to reinforce the sector and for some reconnaissance in force, whereas the second column went to Berdichi to prevent Russian assault groups from capturing Stepove. Overall, the Ukrainian strategy seems to be the following: to launch serious counterattacks west of Krasnohorivka in order to divert as many Russian troops away from the train tracks. That's because the Russian army concentrated a lot of troops in this sector near the waste heap. Ukrainian troops on the ground complained of how the Russians were digging in and entrenching their newly captured positions east of the railway, which would make any Ukrainian counterattack very difficult. Blyat, not the shovels again, not the Bakhmut shovel, no! As you can see in this video, on the 8th of October, Ukrainian artillery heavily bombarded Russian positions near the waste heap, as they were trying to push towards the train tracks north of the coke plant. Also notice the devastating use of cluster munitions. By looking at a map, Russian infantrymen can really only push forward through these two tree lines. The first one is 800 meters long and the second one 1,500 meters. That's the only way for Russian infantrymen to safely leapfrog their way from one foxhole to another towards Ukrainian positions in Stepove. Despite all the propaganda, we also have to mention the weak response of Russian counter-battery fire, which essentially allows Ukrainian artillery units to fire and quickly redeploy without being detected. A big firefight took place on October 31st, north of Avdiivka, when armored elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade were deployed along the train tracks to halt yet another Russian push towards Stepove, such as this Leopard 2A6 and these two M2A2 Bradleys. In this
primul Leopard pe care l-ați văzut va fi filmat de ruși la o zi distanță, deci a doua zi, Leopardul fiind de data asta în flăcări, lovit de un T-72 bătrân, sovietic și desigur ruginit.
These American-made IFVs were not used for offensive operations, such as counterattacks, but simply to provide suppressive fire and to pin down enemy troops, which technically goes against their purpose, especially since these infantry fighting vehicles seem to be on their own without any riflemen in support. Anyway, this is where, so the Ukrainians lost yet another German-made Leopard 2. In this case, a Leopard 2A6. As you can see on the map, it was geolocated right next to the train tracks
adică unul destul de bun, nou și modern.
Between Stepove and the coke plant. According to early reports, it was a Russian T-72 that destroyed the Leopard, but according to Red Effect, it was rather the effect of an ATGM. This confirms the reports of advancing Russian infantry and the concerns of the Ukrainian command I mentioned earlier. What's crazy is that this is the 7th Leopard 2 destroyed this week. Man Oryx left the chat right when it got interesting. So we had this Leopard 2 and this one as well, which was soon followed by a lovely foursome in open air with 3 other armored vehicles that got a huge load and got destroyed right next to it. Number 3 is the Swedish modified Leopard 2A5 near Kupiansk. Number 4 was destroyed at nighttime while equipped with some mine trawl. 2 Leopard 2A4s were destroyed near Robotine as part of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. One of them was hit at a distance and another was struck by 2 FPV drones. I should ask Red Effect, but overall the Russians claim that the Leopard 2s have suboptimal armor, insufficient maneuverability, and excessive dimensions. Personally, I think the main problem is that Ukraine doesn't
Gen este o țintă grasă.
have enough of those. If Ukraine expects to continue this war, they need some form of independence from the West and produce their own military equipment. And according to this Forbes article, as Ukraine loses more and more of its Leopard 2 tanks, it returns to the old T-72s. Anyway, a couple hours after the Leopard 2 was destroyed near the train tracks, the 47th Mechanized also lost an additional 3 M2 Bradleys right behind. And on November 2nd, another one was destroyed a further bit up the tracks. It's okay, finance bros. Nobody knows this. BAE stocks are doing great, to the moon. Despite a lot of trouble, the Russian brute force tactics allowed them to steamroll through enemy lines and secure a crossing point over the railway line right in front of Stepove. Ukrainian artillery crews are really the MVP of the battle. They made the Russian advance west of Avdiivka extremely costly and painful. For example, on October 31st, this column tried to push across this open field in order to flank the village of Stepove. Might be a very sound maneuver on the map, but if we look at the footage, we see a group of 3 destroyed Russian vehicles from a previous attempt, whereas there's an approaching column of 4 BTR-80s. Then the first and second vehicles get hit by mines, the third one stays put, and the fourth one that tries to escape gets hit with an artillery shell. Then the next day, on November 1st, in that same field, another column got hammered. In this one, we see 7 destroyed vehicles from a previous attack, all piled up. Now, what's interesting is that the column is preceded by a mine-rolling tank, followed by 3 to 4 BMPs. They seem to be roaming across the field. Once they're spotted by Ukrainian artillery, they quickly turn back. There are many of these sort of loops all across the terrain, all of which are paths that have been demined, and that could theoretically be used for a future push. Oh, I almost forgot. A few days before they tried it as well, while there was some nice crispy snow. As you can see, the Russians rushed a column of roughly 15 vehicles forward. Once again, the path is opened by a mine-rolling tank, plus another tank right behind.
Da, mai cel rulează mintea, este vorba despre un tank sau un echipament pentru deminare. Da, cum îl vedeți în poză. Dacă mă dau la o parte, îl vedeți. Are un fel de plug în față. Ok? Bun.
To provide suppressive fire. These 2 were followed by almost 12 to 13 BMP and BTRs, with 7 riflemen in each vehicle. That's a company of 91 men on the move. Regardless, Ukrainian howitzers hammered them with very precise artillery fire. And then we see all the Russian infantrymen just fleeing. At least they're running back across the path that was demined.
The men are broken and flee the field of battle!
our walls crumble under the pounding of their weapons! For Russia, losing trained riflemen is much worse than losing a couple armored vehicles that can be retrieved and repaired anyway. From these latest attacks west of Avdiivka, we can believe the Russians want to take control of this area in between both train tracks. As you know, the goal of maneuvering is to improve your current position with a better one, which would then open favorable options to you. From this triangle, Russian forces could flank Berdishi and Stepove, or support the right flank of the encirclement with an attack towards Novokarinove and Kerame. But they could even push to Avdiivka for a strike on Ocheretine. They could even combine some of these maneuvers for a simultaneous push against Ocheretine, for example. As you can see, the control of this small area opens many options to the Russians. And opposite would force the Ukrainians to spread out their forces even more to make sure to cover every one of these positions. Then we have the strategic position of Avdiivka. The importance of this settlement is really straightforward. On this map, you can see all the supply roads linking the Avdiivka garrison to its logistic bases at the rear. They all connect at Avdiivka. So if the Russians capture this village, it's pretty much game over. The Russian army also claims to have fire control over all the roads that bring supplies and ammunition. I think English tourists have better fire accuracy when they're drunk in Spain and it's 4 a.m. As you can see, at this point of the battle, the northern sector is by far the most important. But that doesn't mean that the events taking place on the southern part of the front have to be neglected. The southern flank of the Ukrainian grouping is protected by 5 positions: Svierne, the citadel, this military base near Spartak, the Tsar's Hunt restaurant, and the water filtration station. According to the latest map of Rybar, Russian assault squads have straightened the front line south of Svierne and are now only 1 kilometer away from the village. In this area, some Russian troops are now advancing towards enemy positions using tunnels, like this one, which is 160 meters long. Perhaps in a few days we could expect the Russians to reinforce this sector in order for a general assault on the settlement. And the Russians are also heavily bombarding this sector, which is defended by the Ukrainian 53rd Separate Mechanized Brigade.
Bă, dar cum s-a ajuns la lupta asta? Faza pe tuneluri. Deci, vedem iarăși o îmbinare de strategii din primul război mondial cu strategii moderne, cu drone și alte alea.
Suddenly there seem to be relatively low Russian casualties in this sector as compared to in the north. For sure there's some, like in this video where we see a destroyed BMP near Vadiane and some regular drone dropping grenades. But I think the main difference is that on the southern part of the front there are much less armored vehicles involved and it's much more an infantry battle. So let's say you won't have a spectacular Russian column getting destroyed with all its vehicles piled up. Now, if the village of Svierne falls, it's going to be problematic for the logistics of the Ukrainian army. The Russians could position some ATGMs with direct fire on any vehicle coming in and out of Avdiivka. And of course, they would be one step closer to capturing Avdiivka and closing off the encirclement. Meanwhile, it was reported that Russian assault units also managed a spectacular 2-kilometer push beyond the mine near Opitne, which in theory would now put them within striking distance of the citadel. Once again, this pushes the Russians into a favorable position as they occupy this triangle in between Svierne, the citadel, and the military base. That's all I have for you today.
Mulțumesc pentru vizionare și acum toată lumea, haideți la comentarii. Pa, pa!